cities are constantly evolving. And when you have that understanding of cities as kind of systems of systems, you take that mentality and you can take it to all sorts of different areas, whether it's transportation, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's physical buildings and the types of mixing of uses that happens in those buildings. You start to see them as.
Thank you, Matti, for joining us. Welcome to Untitled Planning. We look forward to, chatting with you and learning more about you than I guess we already know, but I'm diving deeper.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Well, our first question for you is really we want to know a bit more of your origin story. How did you get into planning? We see you all over TV. How did you get into this field?
I've always loved cities and how cities work, how people live in cities, how they're experienced in various ways. And I can remember that going way back for me personally. And I went to Toronto Metropolitan University for undergrad and did the applied geography program at the time. And it was an opportunity to really start to learn more about how cities function and the way that land use influences transportation, influences infrastructure investment, influences people's perceptions of their city and their experiences within them. So that geography foundation was really useful. And then I spent a year in Europe and going to school. And in Europe, got to travel a little bit and learn from just a really diverse group of people and diverse settings and just see cities differently. I grew up here in Toronto and felt I understood Toronto very well. But it was so eye-opening to go abroad and realize there are many different ways to arrange a city and many different ways that people live in cities. And then had the opportunity to go to UBC in Vancouver and see a very different part of Canada. That the ocean and the mountains were stunning and very different than my experience here in Toronto. And so really my origin on cities is just a love of their diversity and their difference, and both in terms of the way people live in cities and their built form, and trying to understand a whole lot more of it has been what's really kept me captivated and interested over now what's been a 15-year career studying and learning more about how cities function.
So just the overall function of the city, how people interact with cities and space, that kind of has always caught your eye.
Yeah, the connection between the physical and the human. That's what geography is, and that's also in many ways what planning is. That planning is about the future of space and the people who inhabit them, and how those two interact, how space shapes human interaction, and then how human interaction in those spaces then shapes what is built and how it gets used and what is built in the future. And I think that really is something that continues to excite and interest me in all sorts of different ways. And cities are constantly evolving. And when you have that understanding of cities as kind of systems of systems, you take that mentality and you can take it to all sorts of different areas, whether it's transportation, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's physical buildings and the types of mixing of uses that happens in those buildings. You start to see them as the scholars Graham and Marvin, Simon Marvin and Steve Graham, they talk about the idea of congealed social interest. And I think that's such an evocative term. The word congealed interests me, and the word social interest interests me as well. This idea that cities are the building blocks of all of the people that have come before. And that's what planning is then. It's about who is involved in that building, what their interests were at the time, and then how the amalgamation of those different interests and the vast sweep of history gets us to what you see today, and ultimately then where we're going is what the role of planning is.
Yeah. And so you talked about you went to Europe, and I think there's something about the important. We talked about in other episodes about the importance of traveling to other places to learn some of like you said, going to UBC, seeing the mountains gave you another impression of what a city could be like and what city living could be like. But I guess in terms of your experience, in terms of cities that you've seen, what were some of your favorite highlights, or what was something that you learned from abroad that you'd wish to see more here?
In many ways, I would say UBC was as eye-opening as being abroad and living in Vancouver and seeing a different side of Canada. I mean, for me, as someone who was born and raised in Toronto and really got an urban awareness in this city, to then see that there was a different way of building a city, that Vancouver that Vancouver has a different built form. It uses different materials. Toronto is a city that historically had been built of brick. Vancouver has it has some brick, but it's much more of a younger city. It has more concrete type of buildings, and then glass and steel as it moves into its big development boom in the 80s, 90s, and into the 2000s, and just a very different visual. And then also the use of wood in that city, and the way that transportation intersects with the water in various ways. I mean, Toronto, for the longest time, it's a city that's on one of the Great Lakes of the world, and yet for decades it didn't feel like you were in a city with a lake and with any access to water. And so to go to a place like Vancouver that has this deep connection with water and deep connection with nature running all the way through it. Again, Toronto has that and has had it with the ravines and with the waterfront, but for a long time it didn't feel like those connections, at least in my life, were as deep as they could. And I think seeing that in a place like Vancouver, and then coming back and watching what's happened with the waterfront redevelopment, which I had the pleasure of being involved in a little bit, sitting on the board of Waterfront Toronto for a few years, and seeing what the process, again, the connection of the physical with the human, the processes of how you stitch a part of the city that had been sort of in our mental map kind of forgotten, stitched back into the city. I think that was really eye-opening. And then you learn from places like Europe, or you learn from Asia as well, about the role of mixing of uses and the role that intensification and density that our cities here in Canada have tended to have dense cores, but have sprawled around their peripheries. In our growth period, we were built around the car, and you're starting to see people starting to come up with other ideas and ways of building our city, of intensification, of transit-oriented communities, and we're really in a struggle right now, as there is huge interest in intensification of our city here in Toronto and across the country, and at the same time we're sprawling around the edges. And so there's kind of like this duality happening all at the same time, which is I think really one of the questions of our time for cities in North America. It is really this question of how does intensification meld with the pressures that still exist around our peripheries, and that urge to go outwards as well as upwards.
So you've been to quite a few cities, right? And so you've described how the differences of physical cities look like, and we talked about the importance of water in the city in Vancouver, and how we've lacked that for a long time in Toronto, but that also shapes how we've interacted with space, right? And like how culture kind of comes out of that. Because I just visited Vancouver a few weeks ago, so it was very beautiful. The physical environment's very beautiful, but really I kind of understand people's kind of like obsession with how they interact with space, and like why they rep Vancouver so hard. It's not necessarily the city itself, but it's like how the city was implemented within the space itself, right?
One of my experiences in Vancouver was when I first got there. You'd kind of go to some of the main commercial areas, especially in the summer, and as a Torontonian and someone who had been to other cities, you'd kind of look around and be like, where is everyone? It's kind of a little bit quiet, a little bit sleepy for a city that's this big. And what you realized was that people weren't sitting around waiting to walk down the main avenues. They were on the beach, or they were out enjoying nature, or they were up at Whistler or Squamish, or really that people were using the city in a very different way. And and each city takes on its own culture and has its own experience. And I think Vancouver of late has become much more of a place that is more of a busy urban experience. And then you come to Toronto, again, to give another experience. I remember as a kid growing up here and it feeling fairly quiet. I mean, Toronto had a reputation of being Toronto the good, and for a long time you couldn't shop on Sundays, and it was a fairly kind of quiet, reserved type of place. And then you'd go to Montreal, and it would just be just excitement and enthusiasm and exuberance on the streets everywhere. I mean, like, to be young in Montreal in a summer has got to be one of the greatest life experiences one can have. And and to come back, and I think what's amazing is of late, there's been so much transferring of these ideas that these ideas can spread much more quickly. That that again, to take a city like Toronto, urban design, for example, has become something that we have embraced in a way that we never did before. We often felt that like function was good enough. And now we talk about like, can we not have nice things here? And we definitely can. I mean, you look at something like Love Park, which just opened, with really, with just that creates a physical space that people can interact in and want to spend time in. You look at some of the urban design on the waterfront, like Sugar Beach, for example. Again, something that these were forgotten spaces that no one thought would be inhabitable. Something like the Bentway or Underpass Park under the ugliest expressway, where maybe 10 years ago there was literally concrete falling off the side of it. It was in such poor maintenance, and it still requires constant vigilance. But you started to see how people are reinterpreting and reimagining and reusing those spaces. And I think that is something that we've both done ourselves as Torontonians, because we know that these spaces have value, but we've also learned from elsewhere that there is a value to having life on our streets and people out and creating. If you create spaces that people want to be, that will be great for our communities. It will be great for business. It will be and it will create places where people can thrive.
Yeah. So after living in all these cities, did you immediately start working at the University of Toronto? Did you did you just jump right into it, or was there a?
So I had an interlude after UBC. I spent 2 years or thereabouts at the University of Glasgow. So moved to Scotland, and again, this experience of living in a place that's very different. I mean, Glasgow is a big Scottish metropolis, and it is energetic, it is boisterous, it is bold. It was again just one of these experiences that tells you a lot. When you go and live in other places, it also tells you about the place you're from. And you start to see your own city through the lens of what those places do really well, and maybe also some of the things they don't do well. I mean, Glasgow had been post-industrial for a long time. It had struggled, and then it went through sort of a culture and arts-led regeneration. It had been big in shipbuilding, and had been a real hub for labor, unionized labor, and industry. And then it goes through this long decline. And what you learn is that like the people that were there love Glasgow and rep Glasgow, and and built it back up into something, and pulled it up because they weren't willing to give up on the place. And it's and they led with this culture-led approach where they did a big waterfront regeneration, and a whole host of other strategies. And again, you start to see your own city through those lenses. And none of these strategies have been perfect. I mean, they've been critiqued as driving gentrification and changing the fabric of the city. But and you learn about some of the trade-offs inherent in all of these policy decisions. And you also learn about a place that just has people there that are just deeply passionate about what it means to be Glaswegian. And again, you start to see your own city through that lens. And so when the job came up to come back to Toronto, I actually had time left on my contract, but it was time to come home. I mean, my family is here, so there was a personal connection, and there was also a connection back to the city and a place that I cared deeply about and really want to have an impact on.
I think that's an important part about planning. I feel like, I don't know, I feel like if you were to ask all the planners kind of how they got into planning, it's like at the core of it is that like love, where it's just like, I love where I live, or I hate where I live, but I know it could be better. Or I've lived somewhere else and I'm like, I kind of like what they do. How do I bring it here, kind of thing? Yeah, we've all been kind of inspired in that way to bring our own communities back to life.
I think that's such a fabulous point. And the way that those ideas transfer and translate is going faster, because of mass travel, and also because of the internet, and you can learn more about this stuff. And I think for each of us, we bring our own set of histories to planning. I mean, it's our own congealed social interest, right? It's, in my case, it's a family tie. It's a deep love and connection with Toronto itself, and again, what it means to be Torontonian, and what the values of this place are, and what it means to contribute in a place that you have deep roots, and but also a place that many people are coming to and then putting down their own roots in their own way. And I think that has been one of the other parts that I've really come to appreciate about Toronto, is how much growth and change has happened, and how it has been, how we've grappled with that and tried to address what happens when you are growing at this pace, and also experiencing as much change and difference as we do. And I think Toronto has really, in many ways, we've both struggled with it and we've excelled. And I think that's, Toronto is a funny place. We depending on who we're talking to, we're both our biggest fans and our toughest critics. And I think in some ways that has enabled us to become better, because we are able to see, and we're able to look at this place and not see it as something that's perfect and freeze it in time, but rather enable others to come and tell their story through the place, and have put their own stamp on it, and enable this place to become better. I think that's on our best days. Yeah. And I mean, obviously we're grappling with all sorts of issues now. We're grappling with housing affordability crisis, drug toxicity crisis, mental health. I mean, it's, and then not to mention crumbling infrastructure and congestion. I mean, the daily frustrations of living in a big city. So we grapple with it. But I think to me, that's what is exciting about being here. And again, as someone who grew up here, to be able to be part of, to be at the university training the next generation, and also to be engaged in the conversations is just something that excites me every day.
It's awesome. I think that's this talking about like living and having a lived experience in many different areas, and we've mentioned this on previous episodes. Like I've lived in many cities. Alex has lived and visited many cities, and that's like played a massive role for myself of just like planning how people interact with the space, and like fortunate to have had a father who was in the architecture planning kind of world as well, and so that's kind of you see something and he kind of explains it to you. He's like, this is made like this because of this reason, and you're just like you're like, I was like, who? Yeah, but it's interesting because a big part of why we're doing this is I think it's really important for people to know why cities are shaped the way they are. And we all have lots of friends, and they kind of ask questions where for us it becomes like the back of our hand. Like we think people should know why we have a waterfront, for example, or like why there's a housing crisis. The first thing someone asked me about housing crisis was, is it just is it because we lack material? And I'm like, well, I was like, well, there's like there's that, but then there's like 10 other factors, right? Or like even more. So it's interesting, and like having different lived experiences, it kind of shows you how other communities operate, whether you're fully conscious or you're subconscious about it too.
I love that thought, because as you're talking, I'm picturing the conversations I have with my kids now, where we have those exact conversations where, we'll look around a city and we'll talk about, why is there a one-story building at the corner of Broadview and Danforth? Right. How many people are not living in our neighborhoods and in our communities because we've kind of frozen that area and made it hard, either financially or from a policy and approvals process, to intensify around there. And that's and we have constant conversations where they ask me stuff and I learn from some of their questions, and I ask them stuff from their perspective. And I think and to your comment about friends and broader networks, I get that too. I mean, in many cases, like you go to a barbecue or a party, and sometimes you get the questions that are so out of left field, and then they just make you think. You're just like, I hadn't thought of it that way. And I think in planning, sometimes we get so used to what the standard answer is, and it's so important for us to be out in the world talking to people who are not in this business or in this field, and maybe see things a little bit differently, to both understand what questions people are asking, but also see it from their lens. And that actually ladders up from the informal to the formal, because that raises the question of how we do planning and engage. Like, for example, communities had been telling us for many years that they were becoming increasingly concerned about transit-oriented gentrification. That when new transit lines were being built, they were worried that like the construction itself was posing a challenge on their neighborhoods. And then once the line was built, they were worried that the rents were going to go up and they were going to get pushed out. And these are the types of things where if you listen carefully, you can both bring a body of knowledge to that shares insight on what has happened elsewhere and what does the research show. And reciprocally, you can also learn from what people are seeing on the ground. And these are the types of things where planning, we're very future oriented, but we're often learning from the past. And that creates this tension where things are going to be built and infrastructure is going to happen or housing is going to get constructed, like before we're able to then catch up with our theory or with our practice. And I think that's where listening to people comes in and can become very important, because they can share with you what they're seeing, and you can then bring to bear the research that exists. Because what's happening here in Toronto or in Vancouver or in Europe, it's never the first time this has ever happened. Like these processes are happening in concert in many different places, and you can try to learn from other people's experiences, and you can either make suggestions that the research doesn't support what is being shown, or conversely, these are the ways we're going to mitigate and be very proactive. And in the case of transit-oriented gentrification, for example, the city of Toronto in recent years has really become aware and has doubled down on trying to put in place policy and practice to enable transit to get built, because it's so desperately needed, but not start that cycle. And these are things that people had been saying many years ago, and it's taken time for us to get to this point. And I think that's part of the process, like whether it's in our own families and our own networks, or whether it's more broadly in the way that we're actually making policy and engaging people in those in the discussions about how our community is changing.
Amazing. So where are you right now as a professional, but as a professor? What's your current projects? Where's your energy being funneled?
Yeah, I feel like I have my dream job. I'm at the university. I mean, how privileged and lucky is that? I'm at the university. I get to teach students, which I think keeps you engaged with new ideas and shaping ideas of how the next generation is going to carry out city building and putting their stamp on our cities and understanding what they're seeing. So I do it at a personal level with my family, but it's more broad with the next generation of students, so that they can understand how to think through, not telling them what the answers are, but thinking through the challenges that we face and grapple with them in their own ways. And the Infrastructure Institute. The Infrastructure Institute was launched 2 years ago. I'm the director, and we look to engage in the maelstrom of policy practice. We aim to bring to bear what a university is excellent at, which is training and knowledge, and translate that into action. And it's such an exciting space, and we've been able to build a team that is remarkably diverse in terms of their expertise and in terms of how they go about it. And what we do is we do a lot of training and capacity building. We are big proponents of giving people the tools and techniques that enable them to engage and make cities more equitable and just. And to me, that's a really important foundation, and providing people with those skills and abilities. So we do work around social purpose real estate. We've talked about already in the last few minutes about the housing crisis and affordability issues. We've worked very hard to work with nonprofits who I think can play one of the key roles in providing different types of housing. We work with nonprofits to provide them with the capacity to carry out their own real estate projects and realize their own dreams and ambitions in a way that turns them from concept to reality. We do advisory work. We work directly with different organizations to provide support and with their ideas of city building. And then I do engagement, and I love being out in the world and talking about cities and talking about planning and trying to, again, do what a university is best at, which is learning from experiencing, bringing knowledge to bear, and trying to translate that into information that people can then draw on and ultimately into action. I think it's that sequence of action that I think is so important, that we really see the university and see our role as both training students who are going to be involved in action and creating initiatives and procedures that allow the university to support those who are doing work in the service of building more equitable, sustainable, and just cities.
Yeah, I guess for context, I mean, I work there.
Yes.
I work with Matti,
Yes.
and Matti was our professor, which is how we all kind of came together.
Yeah.
I guess in this space at the university. But ultimately, I think that's what you just touched on was about that action piece, or that like bridge between. I know there was like bridge between theory and practice. It's always kind of like the I guess the phrase that we hear a lot about, at least in this university, or at least when we're talking about planning. But I think that's what's really exciting about, I guess, the institute's work, but like just in general about planning, is that like how do you take an idea, a seed, and I think that's all planning is really, is a community with an idea, with a seed. They're like, oh, I want to see a skate park. How do you create a skate park? And then you just kind of go through all the ups and downs of doing that. But I feel like what's interesting about this work, or the work that you're doing, is that showing people that there are pathways to make it happen. Because sometimes people have ideas and they just kind of like sit in a closet, or they sit in a drawer of your mind. But then how do you bring them to reality, and then in public space, or in lived space, and then how that shapes the future of how people are living is really fascinating.
Cities are so complex that it can sometimes feel disempowering. It can
Yeah.
feel like maybe that's someone else's job. Like,
Yeah.
I have ideas, I want to get something done, but by the time I raise the capital, or I get the approvals, or like test the idea, the thrill is gone. This is just it's become too much. I'm just going to go back to my day job. And I think what excites me is you see this generation of people coming through now who want to make change in their communities,
Yeah.
and they want to be involved. So I think we've moved away from the idea of like the heroic planner who's going to, by force of will and their own charisma,
Yeah.
is going to do this on their own. And we've started to realize that the way that planning and positive change happens is through collaboration and meaningful relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes that can sound hokey and a bit naive, but actually there are so many levers to pull that no one organization can do it on their own. And we've seen it actually in our own city when organizations have tried to kind of gut it out and just force of will things through, they don't work. This community in particular here in Toronto, but I would say globally too, people like to be part of the process, and they like to be engaged in decision making, and that's where I think collaboration between organizations and involving people in decisions can be important. Now we need action, and it's the action part. I mean, the talking around in circles in perpetuity is also not going to work. The problems that we're facing are so steep and so severe that we, and so significant that we do need that action at the end of it. But we need to be coming up with ways to drive collaboration quicker. There's a body of scholarship that looks at this idea of what's called the collaborative advantage. It's this idea of achieving better outcomes than anyone could on their own. And I think that's how at the Institute, that we're really fortunate that you're involved in, that we've come to think about city building.
I think, with that being said, and with all your experience, now obviously we can't just go like, this is the advice or this is the guidelines for everything, but a question we do like asking our guests, especially who have done a lot of research, it's what's kind of advice for planners, but people who are just involved in or interested in getting involved with their cities, because that's the thing we see is like there's a lack of involvement. Even though once I tell someone I work in city planning, they're like, oh, they have all these questions, or like what's funny, one of my friends, he's quite younger, and he goes like, oh, why don't we just build up? I'm like, you're so right. Like, you're so right, man. Why don't we build up? But like, people do want to be involved, but there's definitely a barrier, right, of entrance, of just like discussion or coming to these like counselor meetings and whatnot. Whether it's like too boring, or it's like doesn't work within the day because people work 9 to 5 and they have kids and they have all these other responsibilities, right? And so it's so
to me, people want to be involved in things that impact on them personally, or impact on the big picture of how they see themselves and their children and their grandchildren living. And I think we need to find ways of engaging people where they're at, and having informed conversations and dialogues about what the likely impact is going to be of some of our policy decisions. And we're facing huge challenges like climate change, we're facing affordability crisis, we're facing mental health, addiction challenges, crumbling infrastructure, how we're going to pay for all of this stuff. And yet we're also facing a democratic deficit. I mean, declining numbers of people, or share of people voting. It's really, so we need to find new spaces and ways to engage people. And I think planning provides a dialogue. I mean, it's funny, not everyone is a transportation expert, but everyone goes out the door and goes somewhere.
Yeah.
Even if they're working from home, they still go to the coffee shop or they go to the grocery store. And, people, sometimes that's the level that people want to start the dialogue at. Yeah. And we need to find ways as planners in different mediums to meet people where they are and to make these discussions issues that feel pertinent and relevant to them and not always feel like we're talking to those who have planners speak. I mean, sometimes we speak in too many acronyms. That's a challenge. Sometimes we speak as if everyone agrees, like intensification. Yeah. I mean, the planning consensus now is around intensification, and yet many people still feel like they want to go outwards, or they don't want a laneway house or a secondary suite in their backyard. And so, we've started to see, that's one of those ones where we've started to see the conversation shift because of the policy urgency. And I think planners and planning really needs to be out there talking about why this is important and what we've learned from other places and what the likely impacts are and what the research shows. We should be leading with the evidence base that the university is really excellent at creating, and then be out in those spaces trying to share as much of this information as possible. And there's all these new spaces. I mean, podcasting is not so new, but it's one. Whether it's engaging on social media, whether it's being in the mainstream media, whether it's being at your local, being out in your community and attending community events. There's all sorts of ways to start engaging and communicating, and I think that's really how we're going to start to see the changes that our communities so desperately need.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Matti. We are done. Subscribe, all of the above.